came to the United States in 1979 from Russia. And my first project was to write a brief history of Russian psychology. In that book, there was a chapter about Vygotsky. And so my editor then said, look, you are writing so passionately about Vygotsky. We have a translation of his book, but it is clear, even from your own text, that the translation is incomplete and some places imprecise. Would you take upon yourself the task of correcting it? And so I said, of course, gladly. The only condition that I put is that it should be published in paperback so that it should be available for students. And they kept their promise, and since then this book became pretty kind of popular among students of education and psychology in the United States.
I still have a letter written in 1975 that Rosa Vygotsky, Lev Vygotsky's wife, wrote to me. Publishing Vygotsky's work is a very difficult thing. Many obstacles make it hard to move forward. We've had permission to publish the work since 1960. The lack of paper is one serious obstacle, but Alexander Luria hopes that this will be overcome.
Надеется это как-то преодолеть, это как-то устранить. Шестой том вышел в 1984.
As a matter of fact, the work was finally published in 1984, 9 years after the letter was written to me.
One of the articles that made Vygotsky well known in this country was by the philosopher Stefan Tulin, who wrote of Vygotsky as the Mozart of psychology. And I think it is a very apt characterization.
It's really hard to understand, what Vygotsky was. You get a lot of different pictures depending on who it is you get the information from. I think there's a tendency to glorify Vygotsky, to exalt him as some kind of fundamentally, he was a genius, no question. If you believe him and his own thinking, most of his thoughts were not original with him, because they never are. He really was living a perspective that said, like Einstein, that we all stand on the shoulders of great men who went before us, or great people in today's terminology.
Vygotsky was not only interested in psychology. So a psychologist cannot be only a researcher in his field or her field. She has to be a scientist who knows what happens in his or her time, in social, culture, political life of the time when he or she lives. This is one of the most important lessons I received from Vygotsky.
Without Vygotsky, there would be no activity theory. That's very clear. And you always have to go back to Vygotsky's work in order to understand activity theory.
The conditions under which Vygotsky and his colleagues were working were horrendous. His passion and commitment to using his life to contribute to creating the new human being that would be consistent with the new society was unlimited.
I don't think there's any question but what he didn't try and keep himself alive, right? He knew what was coming, and he didn't think he could survive it. And many of the people around him did not survive it.
In taking the first step, there are perhaps many serious mistakes we shall be unable to avoid. But the important thing is that the first step has been taken in the right direction. The rest remains to be done. What is in error will fall away, and what is lacking will be made up.
Tsarist Russian society was designed to see to it that all people stayed in their natural station in life. Nobility and clergy got all the privileges. For Vygotsky, the second child of 8 in a Russian Jewish family, this meant his station was the Pale of Settlement. Lev Semenovich Vygotsky was born in the small town of Orsha. When he was 1 year old, the family moved to Gomel. Lev's father was a bank employee. His mother raised the children and ran the household.
Very little is actually known about Vygotsky's childhood and his formative years in, Gomel, which was a town in the western part of Russian Empire.
One of the reasons why we have learned something about Vygotsky's personal life, he didn't ever write about it, was because of his closeness to his daughter, Gita, even though he died before she reached her 10th birthday.
Что касается изобразительного искусства, что касается литературы, языков, тут, так сказать, это было общим.
The interest for fine arts, literature and languages brought the family together. It was a family tradition to get together around a big dining table at night, after the parents were done with their daily businesses and housework, and the children with their school assignments. They called it a tea time, but actually they used to spend time discussing old books, or sometimes reading aloud the classics, or changing their opinions on theater shows that the children always attended. I remember quite well that there were talks and Grandma mentioned something about not being religious.
А так в синагогу они не ходили, и детей к этому, так сказать, специально не приучали.
The family did not attend synagogue. The children were not taught to do this and did not get special religious training, though Lev was interested in religion and knew the Bible quite well.
И он хорошо знал.
Jewish culture and religion posed a threat to the Tsarist regime. Jews could not own their own land, were not permitted to speak Hebrew, and were greatly restricted in terms of settlement, travel, and occupation. Jews were granted citizenship status, but were portrayed as oppressors of Slavic Christians. The most brutal expression of anti-Semitism were the pogroms. Local gang members, laborers, and even police officials targeted Jewish communities for looting, rape, murder, and destruction. While Tsarist authorities didn't plan the pogroms, they sanctioned them.
When Vygotsky was 7 years old, he witnessed pogrom that took place in Gomel, and his father was actually called to testify in court after the events, and I discovered this testimony.
Дело в том, что тогда евреи не могли выбирать себе место жительства.
At that time, the Jews had no right to choose the place of settlement. It was called the Pale of Settlement, a few provinces where the Jews were allowed to stay permanently, inside which they had to find a possible residence.
Он должен был поступать в университет. Родители очень хотели, чтобы он получил такую специальность.
Doctors and lawyers were able to live outside of the Pale of Settlement, and tradesmen had this opportunity as well.
Врачи, адвокаты.
That is why it was such a big issue which career Lev would choose at the university.
Жить вне черты оседлости. Вот они поэтому.
His parents wished that he would get an occupation that allowed him to live outside of the restricted zone. Then he could build his life based on different rules.
Другим каким-то принципам. А для него очень проблематично было даже поступать в Московский императорский университет.
It was a big challenge to enter the university. This move was accompanied with great stress and anxiety. After his application to enter the university had been sent, It was not clear whether he would be admitted, despite his golden medal and a high level of intelligence considering his age.
World War I brought severe chaos and deprivation to the Russian people, which in turn sparked uprising in the Russian Revolution. Peace, bread, and land became the slogan of the day, and civil war continued to ravish the Russian people with injustice, starvation, and violence. Still, what the revolution accomplished was to break down the barriers between classes. For the first time in Russia, people were able to choose their own careers without regard to their social origins. Young people threw their whole being into the new movement because they recognized the opportunities that it offered.
He heartily accepted the revolution because it had abolished the laws discriminating against the Jews.
Formally, all forms of discrimination were immediately abolished, and Jews were no longer confined to a pale of settlements and moved into major centers and so on. On the other hand, very quickly, all forms of religious observance, and here it doesn't matter Orthodox Christian or Catholic or Jewish, were pretty severely suppressed. And so it was not very popular to mention, for example, your traditional Jewish education. Vygotsky got this education and he knew Hebrew, for example, but he naturally would never mention this in any documents because very quickly after revolution, this kind of religious aspect or observance aspect became sort of suspect. Again, not only for Jews, for everyone.
Accepting the advice of his parents, Lev entered medical school at Moscow University. But after 2 months, he realized how distant medicine was from his true interests, and he transferred to the law school at the same university.
Young Vygotsky, when he was a student in Moscow University, wrote several essays on Jewish culture and Jewish history that actually were his first published works.
During the revolution, Lev was a student of 2 Moscow universities. He graduated from Moscow University and the University of Shanavsky. His diploma thesis was called Hamlet or the Tragedy of the Prince of Denmark, about the play by William Shakespeare. It was his first research paper, which showed he already was a mature researcher. He started writing his diploma thesis in 1915, completed and submitted it to the university board in 1916.
He was a man. Take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. William Shakespeare. Scientific psychology was born almost simultaneously in America, England, Germany, and Russia. Until 1880, psychology was a facet of the humane or moral sciences. In 1911, the first officially recognized Institute of Psychology was founded at Moscow University. Vygotsky himself began his psychology career in 1918.
Vygotsky was teaching Russian language and literature at a vocational school and psychology in a local teachers' college, where he organized the first Belarusian laboratory of psychology. He called it a cabinet of psychology. While Lev Vygotsky was conducting scientific experiments at his laboratory of psychology, he completed his 5 psychological investigations and prepared 3 reports based on them. At this time, the All-Union Psychological Congress took place in St. Petersburg, and my father went as a Belarusian delegate to present his 3 reports there. His first reports impressed the audience so much that he was invited to teach in Moscow at the Institute of Psychology.
Александр Романович Лурия вспоминал,
Alexander Romanovich Luria recalled that when Vygotsky went to stage, he had a little piece of paper in his hand. And from time to time he took a glance, and Alexander Romanovich thought there were his thesis notes.
Александр Романович решил, что это конспект его доклада.
He was very surprised later when he approached Vygotsky during the break and found that there was nothing on the paper, it was blank.
И увидел, что на листе бумаги ничего не написано.
Maybe because he was worried about his report, Vygotsky just held the piece of paper in his hand.
Поддержки духа имел такой конспект.
Lev Semenovich returned to Gamal from Congress, resigned from the college, the theater, and the laboratory of psychology. Rosa Smekova accompanied Lev to Moscow, where she became his wife.
I remember the wondrous moment when before me you first appeared, like a fleeting vision, like a spirit of pure beauty. In the anxious moments of hopelessness and sadness, the anxiety of the noisy world, a tender voice called to me at length, and your tender features appeared. We must determine what we can and must get from Marxism. What we need is not disconnected statements, but a method.
What is a Marxist psychology? Because there are some people who saw relationships between Marx and Freud. That was no longer the case when I was there. But does it Marxist mean just what Marx wrote or Lenin wrote, or did it mean what, say, Habermas or Adorno? I mean, no, that absolutely not. There's the answer in the Soviet Union at the time.
For me, this is above all a legacy of a different kind of science that is deeply involved in changing the world. In that sense, it's a legacy of the Marxist idea that, as Marx wrote, the philosophy must not only explain the world but transform it. And that aspect of the work of Marx was very dear to Vygotsky and all his disciples. So, and I think that's still the thread that keeps this theory being avant-garde.
Vygotsky demanded that psychology become more than a scientific study of education and go beyond the abstract theoretical knowledge and intervene in human life and activity, helping to shape it. A psychologist must be a thinker and a practitioner as well.
Им предложили молодым ученым перестроить всю психологию коренным образом.
Young scientists received the proposal to dramatically restore the science, using Marxism as a foundation. Such scientists as Luria, Vygotsky, and A.N. Leontiev didn't know where to start.
И начали они с того, что они перетаскивали столы и стулья.
So they started with moving tables and chairs and changing the names of laboratories. This, they thought, this is the way to build a new psychology.
Vygotsky, Luria, Leontiev составили мощную тройку ученых.
These young scientists, Vygotsky, Luria, and Leontiev, eventually joined into a very powerful group of scientists. And twice a week they got together at Lev Semyonovich's place to discuss scientific plans and projects.
Молодых студентов-психологов МГУ, 5 человек.
Step by step, the group grew, adding new participants, especially these 5 students.
Это Бажович, Славина, Александр Владимирович Запорожец, Наталья Григорьевна Морозова и Роза Евгеньевна Левина.
Later, all these 5 students became very famous professors in different areas.
Работающими в разных областях.
Luria had done this work in Central Asia, which was cross-cultural work, we would call it. For them, it was kind of cross-historical. They had people who were under forced conditions of very rapid, unpleasant conditions, very rapid modernization that was pushed by the Soviet government on the people of Uzbekistan and they now call Kyrgyzstan. People who were not literate and who were pastoralists and had a traditional way of life started going to schools or working collective farms in these new forms of labor. And according to their theory, the way that people think should change when you get that kind of historical change. And so I had remembered right before my wife and I left Moscow in 1963, Luria pulling up these sheets of paper on which were written dialogues with these Uzbeki peasants, and the one you simply can't forget because it sort of sticks in your mind, is that it says, well, my friend Ivan, all bears in Siberia are white. My friend Ivan went to Siberia and saw a bear. What color was it? And the peasant says, how should I know what color it is? Ivan's your friend, Go ask him.
At one point, Leontiev interfered with Luria and Vygotsky's friendship. When Luria finally talked with Vygotsky about the conflict, he apologized for his part in it. Luria continued to apologize for the rest of his life.
There are many different stories about the relationship between Vygotsky and Leontiev and the side that Elkonin took. I think it's important when looking at any of these things to realize that everybody, when reflecting on their own life story, once you get past the age of 20 anyway, say, well, I used to think this, but I think that now. I've changed a lot. There's a basic thread of continuity, perhaps, but hopefully I don't think the same thing when I'm 40 that I thought when I was 20. I've learned something more, and we change over time. So a career can have many different stages, and so it's not as if there's a frozen in time, single, coherent Leontiev who came into contact with a frozen in time, single, coherent Vygotsky.
There has been a tendency in some circles to sort of try to put Vygotsky and Leontiev against each other in various ways. One version is that Vygotsky was basically interested only in semiotic mediation by science, and then Leontiev was only interested in mediation by material artifacts and tools, and that somehow these two clashed. And while it's true that they really did discuss and debate this issue, at the same time they saw their respective approaches absolutely complementary and necessary for one another.
They never had a chance to work out their relationship from 1934 until the time of Leontiev's death, so we don't know in what sense how they would have gone on.
He was working a lot and trying to fight a terrible disease that had been eating him up since 1920. It was tuberculosis that aggravated him from time to time. In 1925-26, the outbreak of the disease was so severe that doctors measured his remaining life in terms of 2-3 months. He realized that the end was close. While lying still in the hospital, he feverishly started to write his famous work entitled Historical Meaning of the Crisis in Psychology.
Somehow, doctors managed to save Lev Semenovich using a special medical procedure that they had to repeat every month. In 1925, his daughter Gita was born, and his other daughter Asha was born in 1930. Alexander Romanovich was responsible for distributing free permits to sanatoriums. He got the best permit for Vygotsky, but when he brought it to his friend, Vygotsky tore the permit to pieces. He didn't want to survive at the possible harm coming to Luria for providing the permit.
Вы знаете, с одной стороны, мне кажется, что он понимал, что дело движется.
He knew that the end was close, and he tried to accomplish what he wished to do and to deliver the ideas which came into his head.
Те идеи, реализовать те идеи, которые, так сказать, высказал, которые ему пришли в голову. Более того, я даже очень хорошо помню, весной 30...
Moreover, I remember quite well when in the spring of 1934, not long before the end, an unusual conversation between my father and mother took place. They had never talked about this subject in front of me, but it happened that I witnessed their discussion. Mother was saying that doctors insisted on hospitalization and asked him to stop working. Father refused quite flatly. He was a very soft-spoken man. There is no point to ruin the student's term, he said. As soon as I finish the academic year, we will arrange my stay in the hospital. This conversation took place in March, but on the 9th of May, he was brought home from work suffering a throat hemorrhage. I remember the exact day. It was my birthday and I had a group of children at home. In the morning, my father told me before going to work, I will try to come home earlier. And after they brought father home from work, he asked me to come closer and said very softly, I have promised you I would come, so here I am.
During the night between the 10th and the 11th of June, 1934, Lev Semenovich passed away from a throat hemorrhage. He was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery.
Тогда и было принято это знаменитое, плачевно известное постановление Центрального комитета от 4 июня.
On July 4th, 1936, the well-known lamentable decree of the Central Committee, officially blemishing the name of Vygotsky, was issued. Moreover, there were disgusting articles and books in which he was depicted as an idiot or threat to society. The reader could come to whatever conclusion he or she wanted.
Значит, а уже о том, что он враг народа, она хотела, чтобы вы самостоятельно догадались.
The idea of pedology, which was a word, something like educational psychology and testing in today's terminology, is a word that Vygotsky had used. He was critical of pedology in many of its instantiations, but because he had used it, basically he was the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater at that point.
И поэтому...
Consequently, his books were confiscated. Even in the Central Public Library, his articles were cut out and destroyed. Instead of the missing pages, there was a special stamp that said, cut out according to the decree of the Central Committee dated July 4th, 1936.
Мне, наконец, через 3 месяца моих хождений,
It took 3 months for me to be able to get permission to view a book written by Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. What I was looking for was the introduction written by Vygotsky.
мое удивление,
You can imagine my surprise when also you could read Freud's book in Russian. There was no introduction written by Vygotsky. And again, the same stamp, it was removed because it was pedagogical material.
The really terrible years in 1936-37, the great purges were just getting underway. I think there's little doubt at all that Vygotsky would have disappeared one way or the other, been executed, died in camps or whatever.
The Great Purge in the Soviet Union was a series of campaigns of political repression and persecution. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, perceived anti-revolutionaries and enemies of the people were put in gulag labor camps or killed.
We live not feeling the country beneath us, our speech inaudible 10 steps away, but where they're up to half a conversation, they'll speak of the Kremlin mountain man. His thick fingers are fat like worms, and his words certain as pound weights. His cockroach whiskers laugh, and the top of his boots glisten. And all around his rabble of thick-skinned leaders, he plays through services of half-people.
Ну вот, скажем, в институте, который...
I'd like to say something about the institute founded by Lev Semyonovich. Most of his close friends, associates, and colleagues worked there, and from there he conducted his research until the end. It was from this institute his coffin was carried to the cemetery. And there was an associate who appeared to be employed as an agent with the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. This agent was searching for Vygotsky's books at the institute and making sure that everybody burned them.
Я знала людей, которые буквально за пазухой.
Many people hid Vygotsky's books under their clothes and under their coats when agents, probably KGB agents, went searching their apartments.
К ним в дом приходили с обыском. Поэтому шеститомное собрание сочинений стало возможным.
Only thanks to this were 6 volumes of Vygotsky's works saved in different private and state archives, so they could be printed.
В многочисленных государственных и частных архивах. Я работала в архивах у Александра Ивановича Лурия дома.
I worked at Alexander Luria's place at his archives and also in the archives of other specialists.
When Stalin died in 1953, to me, one of the most intriguing chapters in all this is Vygotsky was basically banned from public academic discourse in the 30s on through until Stalin died in 53. In 1956, the first volume of Vygotsky's works come out under the leadership of people like Luria and Leontiev. So as his students, even though they might have disagreed, even though there might have been competition for what's the real theory of mind or whatever, they were instrumental in creating a Vygotskyan or neo-Vygotskyan school of thought in Moscow in those years.
Поэтому большинство работ Льва Семеновича были...
Many of Lev Semyonovich's works were destroyed. Actually, the majority of them.
Ряд работ, а этот факт очень интересный, я о нем почти никогда не рассказывала.
Luria told me that several of Lev's works had been translated into English.
Перевели на английский язык. Русский вариант...
The Russian versions were destroyed and survived only as English versions.
Вновь переводить с английского на русский.
Later, it was a very difficult task to publish them, because his works had to be translated from English back into Russian, a double translation. The works in their English version did not really allow researchers to know the true original meaning of his phrases. 3 different chief editors passed away without seeing the books published. After Luria died, Leontiev became the chief editor, and then there was Zaporozhets. Davidov, an editor, accomplished the task of actually getting the books out.
A true testament to Lev Vygotsky was the establishment of the L.S. Vygotsky Psychology Institute at the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow. During the Institute's annual conference, professionals from around the world meet to discuss Vygotsky's theory and how it's being applied.
I want all of us to think this over and understand that our power lies in diverse ways of thinking, which primarily originates from Vygotsky's theory. Our power is in diversity and cultural variety of thinking. Vygotsky was a super versatile person. He was a person of encyclopedic learning. His style of analysis was historically generic and systemic. He was a moderate social constructivist, which is the peculiarity of our whole school. Vygotsky's school has been a school of liberal philosophy from the very beginning.
In 1996, when there was 100th birthday of Lev Vygotsky, there was such a grand conference, and during this conference, the Presidium and the Science Soviet of University decided to give us the name of Vygotsky because, first of all, we based on the theory and tried to make popular of the theory and to make a basis on our education, and then because we have some scientific research based on this theory, and so in 1996 it became the name of Vygotsky.
A scientist's contribution is determined not only by the problems they've worked on and solved, but also by the extent to which their work influences further development and resolves current problems.
Vygotsky создал свою версию культурной истории.
Vygotsky developed his own version of cultural and historical psychology related to the analysis of actions by means of acts of mediation.
Связано с анализом актов опосредствования или актов медиации. Вот. И
he left behind the ideas of the natural biological development of the psyche and changed over to the ideas of a cultural development of the psyche. Up until now, the puzzle has been how culture is an environment. How does culture go from the brain to be transformed into the culture of an individual person?
Культура, трактуемая им как идеальная форма, она присутствует с самого начала рождения человека.
I think what Vygotsky contributes to psychology is very distinctive because he really sees us developing in the context of history, in the context of social relations, in the context of the enormous variety of cultures that characterizes our species.
The main difference between Vygotsky and probably any other psychologist in the 20th century is his emphasis on that psychological development is not natural individual development, but the result of appropriation and internalization of cultural tools. And that's why a theory is called either cultural historical or socio-cultural. Both names emphasize the importance of social and cultural element in forming our psychological functions.
It's interesting, Vygotsky had a very broad-ranging theory, and many pieces of it look not so different from other major theorists of the 20th century, 19th and 20th century of the human mind. In some ways, he looked like Freud, believed in the power of early experience to shape human consciousness throughout life, and the unconscious to the extent he talked about it, although he less so with the years. But he looked a lot like other well-known, important scholars at the time, Piaget, Dewey, James. I think that Vygotsky had the most interesting and unique thing to say about human consciousness, though, when it came to mediation. And the reason for that was, it had largely to do with his early career. Vygotsky started his career in the humanities, and a drama critic, a philologist. His first work was on an analysis of Hamlet that he wrote as a teenager and then turned into a volume later. And so he's always very interested in artistic, literary texts, drama texts, film. He's a good friend of Eisenstein and worked with Eisenstein in some ways. So he's interested in all these kind of semiotic, textual aspects of human life. And I think his great genius was to take what we knew about psychology at the time and say human mind is fundamentally shaped by the cultural tools that we use, like film, like human language, like maps, charts, mathematics, whatever. And so in the end, in my reading anyway of Vygotsky, what you're looking at is an answer to the question, what makes us human? Because he was always saying what makes us human depends on the particular cultural context we're in. That's why he's known today in some people as a cultural psychologist. And the way that we have access to culture and the social formations that we live in has to do with the cultural tools we use. So you learn to speak a particular language, and not just a national language like English or Russian or Thai or something, but ways of speaking. You learn to speak a particular language, you have a particular form of human consciousness. It's not because the language imposes it on yourself, you have to go out and master it. So there's an active individual involved.
I was trained as an experimental psychologist, a quantitative experimental psychologist in this country by an outstanding scientist. There's nothing in my background that I actually interpreted what Vygotsky was doing in sort of American behaviorist stimulus response terms initially, because there was a way there to use the term a mediated response. This idea of mediation, of something that is between people, is that people interact with each other through stuff. And the through could be language, the through could be computers, the through could be pencils and writing, the through could be lots of different kinds of things. But all of those things are some aspect of the environment that you're in that somebody at some time has picked up and tried to use to regulate their interactions with other people in the world, and modified it a little bit to make it work better for their purposes, and it sort of works. So the next person that comes along inherits that way of doing things, and they improve on it given their conditions. And so the total accumulation of all those ways in which humankind has modified the world, that's what culture is. It's not just things, and artifacts are always both have an ideal and a material aspect. There's an idea to them. The basic, Vygotskian ideas are, first of all, the idea of mediation through the products of prior human experience. That's culture, embodied in words and all the other kinds of artifacts that we use. The idea that development in an important sense comes from the outside, not the way Americans think of sort of environmental direct influence, but the adults who have to care for this very immature organism, who will die without adult care. They're the bearers of the cultural past. They're the bearers of the toolkit of what to do. But practically speaking, you want to start to use your ideas about how development works to create environments that are going to produce what, from your point of view, is higher levels of development, more independence of the individual, more ability to interact with the other people without killing them off, more ability to interact with the environment without destroying it, but in learning to control yourself at the same time. So they had this very interesting idea that as you pick up a tool to use it, you not only get more control over the external world, you're subordinated to the tool. You have to use it in a particular way.
These cultural tools, all of which fall under the heading of mediation, then, that fundamentally shape who we are, and it means that I am different from I would have been had I been raised in the Soviet Union in my lifetime, or I'm different from my ancestors were growing up in the same but not different, historically speaking, American context, because we're surrounded by different tools. For Vygotsky, the idea was that we are largely who we are because of the broad sense I use here, the texts that we master. Texts are forms of mediation, or sometimes we call them cultural tools in sociocultural studies. So when you learn to speak a particular language, you're fundamentally shaped by that fact. Now, you tell this to your grandmother, that's not a big surprise, but this is not the way we oftentimes tend to think of things in psychology. We tend to look for universal kind of human cognitive capacities. Vygotsky's saying what's really interesting in many ways is how, by mastering a particular set of languages, cultural tools, films, things like that, we become particular kinds of people. For some people, this might sound like, well, this is a form of extreme relativism or even postmodern thought, that everybody has their own texts and they just shape differently. Vygotsky was never, I don't think he's a good candidate at all for being a postmodernist, because to some degree anyway, he was shaped by the Marxist debates going on at his time, with the idea that there are higher and higher levels of social formations and higher forms of human consciousness. And also, Vygotsky himself was very much a product of kind of what we could call traditional European schooling. He had very strong beliefs that by mastering more abstract forms of thinking, like mastering algebra, not just arithmetic or counting systems, but algebra, we've reached a higher level of human consciousness. That's not very relativistic. That's saying, no, there are higher, more advanced forms of human consciousness. And a good part of Vygotsky really was deeply committed to this kind of enlightenment project. So when I use the term sociocultural, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to come up with a hybrid version here that says, yes, there are higher and lower forms, that is more abstract and less abstract forms of human reasoning, but on the other hand, that can never explain cultural differences that cannot be ranked from higher to lower. Cultural differences of this sort have been ranked by many people from higher to lower since the 19th century, at least in the German tradition of scholarship, but the problem always has been the people ranking them from higher to lower are always at the very top, looking down at the others coming up toward them. The Navajo grammar is equally, if not more complex than anything you'll find in an Indo-European language, for example. You can't rank these. But when you try to combine the insights of cultural difference with the insights that there are higher and lower forms of mental functioning, at least on some abstraction metric, then I think you have both sides of Vygotsky. And the reason I want to put those two terms together is an indication that I'm not buying into one or the other, because I think you can read Vygotsky and find both of these in there. And that's one of the sources of inspiration, but it also is a source of contradiction. And hence we need a term that I think he did not use himself.
He was clearly influenced by Piaget. And part of what contributed to his ability to work through so many different possible theorists was that he translated many psychological writings into Russian. And in that process of translation, he sort of went through like a tunnel their theory and ended up on the other end and found his own way of thinking about some of the concepts.
Vygotsky said, Piaget's analysis of egocentric speech, what he called egocentric speech, and Vygotsky called it egocentric speech as well, in Russian, egocentricheskaya rечь. So he used the same term, but he said the significance of the function, the meaning of it is completely different. This is not a remnant of egocentric perspective that's dying out. Rather, this is a new form of speech that's starting to split off what was the original form of speech, a social speech, that's starting to be taken over to form individual mental functioning. And we've had a fair number of studies. I'd say that the jury is still out as to what's really conclusive deciding between those two perspectives. But it reflected a fundamental difference in how you read what was going on in childhood, even for early Piaget, who was more socially oriented.
The first important thing was that I realized that what was known in Western countries with respect to Vygotsky was completely misleading. For instance, the problem of Vygotsky-Piaget, it was a kind of a debate already known in Italy at that period. But I discovered that Vygotsky was a completely different style of thinking about childhood. Probably, I think, my opinion is that Vygotsky had a different attitude toward this problem because he started with deaf, dumb, handicapped, disabled children, with homeless children, whereas Piaget worked with his son and daughter, with young children in the good school in Switzerland, or maybe in Italy, or maybe in France. Of course, Vygotsky was especially interested in the development of mind. But he was against the idea that the mind in the child develops depending on the maturation of the brain. So we have different stages of cognitive development parallel to the development of brain. This was the idea followed by Piaget. He had the very new idea that we can have a change in cognitive processes depending on culture, on context, on technology. Of course, Vygotsky did not know the computer. He knew only the influence of printing, of writing in the history of human society.
On the one hand, Piaget was talking about development consists of taking on a broader and broader world perspective out of the egocentric beginning. Vygotsky says development amounts to becoming more of an individual out of a kind of a hotbed of social life, which is there first. And so you're going from social to individual for Vygotsky, and in a sense, from individual to social for Piaget. Hence, the same phenomenon, egocentric speech, two different interpretations of what it was. And the big challenge, it seems to me, for an American is that our psychology reflects our individualistic culture in a very fundamental way. We assume that you could build social psychology, for example. There's a natural assumption that you start with individuals and then you see what happens when you put them into groups. Just as for Piaget and Vygotsky, the opposite, the opposition there, the opposite comes to fore in the Russian setting, that in a sense the group exists first and the individual comes out of that, and you're never completely separate from it. When confronted with in such bald terms, most Americans say, well, of course you're part of a social group, but there's the you there first. And in a sense, Vygotsky started out with this different idea, I think, that we grow out of the social milieu in which we've been born into. And that doesn't mean we're helpless puppets on a stage of social processes. There is individual will. There's possibility to shape your own existence. You have to actively engage with this, first of all. It doesn't just kind of vibes don't come into your head or something like that. But there's a very much stronger orientation toward the assumption that individuals come out of social life rather than vice versa. The basic move, again, for Vygotsky and his colleagues was social reality comes first, is the milieu in which out of which individuals emerge. The basic move in the American psychological tradition is much more individualistic, which just reflects American culture, I think. It says first you have individuals and then groups form. And yes, they can help the individual develop further, but you got to start with this individual. That's the basic building block.
Now we understand what was the core of his idea. That is that depending on the technology, and the technology changes with the history, with the context. We have now computer, television, and so on. We can have different paths of brain development. So the child today of 4 years old is completely different from the child of the same age at the beginnings of the past century.
Today's youth are surrounded by things that go beyond the internet, iTube, all kinds of things, that kind of instant messaging, these kinds of things. Vaguely we have the idea that these are shaping how we think, what we call generally human mind or human consciousness, but only with somebody like Vygotsky recognizing that the key lies in understanding their role in shaping human mind, do we ironically have some of the best tools for dealing with the very latest things happening to the human consciousness of today. I think, it's hard for us to keep the eye on the ball because of this notion of kind of almost distributed cognition that he had. It's a new term, but he had an old version of this, namely, your mind is not between your ears. Your mind is you and the cultural tools you're using together, and they do almost some of the thinking and speaking for you. Together you almost form a co-authored kind of activity stream. So on the one hand, there's this idea that we have to get beyond the individualism, and that's where it's still hard for us to get full mileage out of Vygotsky, it seems to me, in the United States anyway. And in addition, if we get onto this issue of how important these mediational means are, look around you, see all the different kinds of mediational means we have today that young children are learning. So human consciousness is changing right now, and Vygotsky gives us a way to understand how that could be studied.
Of course, it's extremely interesting to see how Western psychologists and educators became interested in Vygotsky's theory at the end of 20th century and beginning of 21st century. This is a paradox in itself. How theory established, built, written up in Moscow of 1920s and 30s resonates with the concerns of European and American psychologists and educators of the 21st century. And here my answer is that probably Vygotsky developed certain answers to the questions that Western psychology failed to ask. Only now, because the questions started being asked and posed, like the question of multicultural education. What to do in a classroom where you have children belonging to different language groups, different ethnic groups, different cultural backgrounds, how to teach them. That was a question that some of Vygotsky's work responded to, more than 70 years ago.
Я уверен, что он с этим бы согласился.
I'm convinced that Vygotsky would agree, although he himself had not formulated this notion. Culture as a productive kind of existence, an existence which bears fruit. This is a quote from Boris Pasternak. Culture is an environment which grows and nurtures the personality. Culture is the language which unites humanity and does not divide it.
Культура – это язык, который объединяет человечество, а не разъединяет человечество.
I am for practicing psychologists, for practical work, and so for the broad sense, for boldness, and for the advance of our branch of science into life.
I'll give you one story that I found particularly telling when it was written up by one of Vygotsky's intellectual students, descendants, a guy named Meshiryakov, who wrote about deafblind children. And he's very strong Vygotskyan, worshipped Vygotsky's ideas, and set up a school for deafblind children. That means children usually from birth who had been deaf and blind. And one of the little telling episodes for an American he writes about in there is the way he goes about formulating the curriculum for these students, and our most famous story in the West, namely Helen Keller. As you know, Helen Keller, the story of Helen Keller has this telling episode of her whole life when she and her teacher, Anne Sullivan, are out pumping water in the hand, and Anne Sullivan spelling water with palm spelling at the same time. And there's this great breakthrough that Helen Keller suddenly realized, oh, I can communicate with people. Our whole way of telling this story, which makes perfect sense to Americans, if you think you're religious or not, but it really does have to do with kind of Judeo-Christian soul notion. Helen Keller was born with a soul, obviously. She had a soul. It was seeking desperately to find a way to break through, to be in communication with other souls. Meshiryakov, the student of Vygotsky's, set up his whole school with quite the opposite assumption. And it can sound crude or brutal almost. He's saying, yes, these are human organisms that are deafblind children, but he documented cases, and you start to think about it, this maybe not so unusual. Some kids came to his school at the age of 6, and they didn't know the difference between night and day. It's not clear that they even knew the difference between human and non-human objects. I mean, they were really isolated. So for Meshiryakov, the point was, yes, these are human organisms, but only when they're social, they come into the social group, and they've never got into the social group in the first place in some way, do they then become individuals. They're not souls that start out waiting to come out of their trapped world, out of their bubble. They're souls, they're organisms on the way to becoming selves or souls, or whatever you think the end point here of individual psychic reality is.
In the small town of Suryev Posad, known as Zagorsk, just 40 miles outside of Moscow, is a home for the deaf and blind. Children here are taught to communicate using methods inspired by the concepts of Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky believed that even severely disabled children can be transformed into intelligent adults. Sasha, a former Zagorsk student, is himself deaf and blind. In the 1970s, as part of an innovative experiment, Sasha was one of 4 Zagorsk students to graduate from Moscow University. Another successful Zagorsk student and Moscow University graduate is Natasha.
Me your hand, and I'll tell you who you are. In my silent darkness, clearer than the dazzling sunlight, is all you would hide from me. More than words, your hands speak to me of all you decline to say. Trembling anxiety or quivering rage, true friendship or a lie. All is revealed in a touch of a hand, who is a stranger and who a friend. I see everything in my silent darkness. Give me your hand, and I'll tell you who you are.
In the University of Oulu, Finland, is a child development experimental lab that bases its research on Vygotsky's methodological approach. For Vygotsky, a child's play is their first cultural activity and the leading source of the zone of proximal development. All creative activities spring out from play to provide enculturalization.
I work in Oulu University in Finland, and we have set a research laboratory there in campus, which is a creative play group for young children. University teachers and I am doing research on child's play using Vygotsky's ideas. So we have two groups of children there coming every week, and these are children from 0 to 6 years old. If we want children to become creative, we have to create such an environment which motivates them to create. What we're seeking is to enhance and to stimulate children's pretend play.
Our understanding of play has changed quite radically with the help of Vygotsky's ideas. In spite of the fact that he was not writing so much about play, we are not looking at play so much as cognitive activity. We have taken the idea of aesthetic reaction and the aesthetics of play, and I think this is a kind of radical change how we can interpret what play is. I think Vygotsky is the only person who has developed a kind of holistic approach to development, and his theoretical work is first of all theory of development.
Simon Fraser University is rated as one of Canada's top universities. Today, students of a Masters of Education class are presenting a Vygotskyan exercise.
Vygotsky-Sakharov classic experiment of artificial concept formation is one of the most famous experiments of Vygotsky. We use it to understand the mediation power of a language in the process of concept formation. Vygotsky taught us that language and thought in the development enter different relations in different stages of development. But not only he taught us about it theoretically, he experimentally led us to observe the process of concept formation, which is led by mediation by artificial word.
They have a funny language on the moon. It sounds very, very different. So here we have bow. Mm-hmm. So I want you to try to find
another bow.
Another bow. There's a few bows in there.
How many can I pick?
Well, I just want you to start looking.
What is interesting in this experiment is we get to observe how child is forming the concept using this artificial moon-like language.
This looks exactly like a bow.
Okay. Oh, Dimitri, that's great. That's a bow. So, do you think there's any other bows? It's a funny language, isn't it?
It doesn't appear to be the case, just two of them.
Are you sure?
No.
Well, I would encourage you to explore a little more. See it. Okay. It's another bow. What can you tell me about what you think a bow might mean?
Bow, flat triangle, flat triangle.
Okay, are there any other flat triangles out there? Why don't you flip it over yourself and see what that says? Oh, that's close, but that says Bach. It's a little puzzling, isn't it? So it's almost a bow, but it's not quite a bow. So, what do you think the difference is between a bow and a bach?
The Bach is a little bit higher.
Okay, so do you think you can find any other Bachs in the group?
I use the Vygotsky block experiment, Vygotsky-Sakharov double stimulation experiment in my graduate classes when I teach Vygotsky theory. One of the goals for me to use these experiments, I want my students to see how the concept, artificial concept gets created, and another goal is to explain to them the basis, theoretical and methodological basis for dynamic assessment.
Do you think any of your friends here can help you find another Bach? It's kind of tough, isn't it?
Yeah, the Bach is a tricky one.
How about you try to see if that's a Bach? Oh, it's not. Sorry to confuse you. That's a gag. Okay, so let's just turn these over here. So clearly, there are some similarities and some differences. What about yellow?
Boff.
Oh, another Boff. So have you found another family?
Yes, I think I have.
So can we find any
circles?
other Boffs?
This is a Boff. Oh. Oh, but that's an E or an F here?
They are confusing on that moon, aren't they?
I think that's a Boff.
Those moon people are a funny bunch. Okay, so that is a Boff. So we have Boff, Boff. That was just a spelling error that they made up on the moon. So we have Boff, Boff. Any other Boffs?
I don't think so.
Okay, so how would you characterize these different families? And based on that, do you think you can complete the group?
One of the criteria at the end of it, we will ask a student to verbally define the concept as to ensure that the real concept has been formed during the experiment.
Okay, well, this will be a jack.
Okay. How about this one? Where do you think this should?
That's probably a off.
And what characterizes an uff?
Small and relatively
high?
High.
Okay.
Bob.
Bob.
It's a new group.
What about these ones?
I think this will be an up.
Okay.
Yes.
We have a couple of orphan shapes over here that are really drifting.
Right.
And that's fine. That happens, especially on the moon. Okay, well that's great. I think you've done a great job figuring out the families here. So well done.
The fifth dimension is the end point of a long 20 some odd year period of my coming to try to understand what these mad Russians were talking about when I went there in the early 1960s. And the thing about their way of thinking about human development and human life in general is that culture is the medium of human life. We created the fifth dimension in order to take advantage of several Vygotskian principles at the same time. So you have the idea of mediation, you have the idea of more capable peers, you have the idea of providing enough helps so that you're not doing the whole thing, but kids can experience higher levels of the thing that they're trying to do. You have the idea that you sort of, you use communication a lot.
Here we attempt to create a very different culture that is not the home culture, nor is it the school culture. We draw from both of them so that we think that this is a bilingual, bicultural environment.
We have moms who come in and help us help. We have high school kids who come in and help us help. So there's a tremendous, it's a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-institutional hodgepodge, but it is organized around the idea that the adults give as little help to the kids as they can, but enough so that they and the kids are having a good time. The undergraduates change every 10 weeks. The kids often stay for a year or two. Who's the expert? On what? So my students get the idea that a zone of proximal development requires both play and instruction.
One of the reasons why we attempt to level the hierarchy in many ways, is that the children and the adults and everybody is learning from each other. A lot of these children do not speak in class, they don't interact well in school, they're either silent or they're disruptive. We're trying to create a new vision of who they are and how to imagine themselves, to move away from the constraints that are put upon them anywhere else.
A lot of the kids from this neighborhood in particular go home to apartments where there might be a dozen people living, where their teachers are trying to reach out to them using the internet, and the teachers are working like hell to do a good job, but there's no DSL at home. In fact, there's no computer at home. In fact, there's no place to put a computer at home, so the kids get in trouble. Then the teachers say use the library, but if you go and you look in the library, there aren't enough computers, there's not enough resources there for the kids.
The point is, for my students, is not to come and teach them mathematics or science, but to work with them in a way that the children learn to learn, so that they can take those principles from here and move on and be interactive learners and thinkers.
And that's sort of our rule of thumb way of saying whether or not it's the conditions for a zone of proximal development. Here we do a wide variety of things. We use basic literacy programs because these kids are behind. Dr. Seuss, ABC, or Reader Rabbit, the kind of thing you might buy for your kids at home. We have a small company that has a net-based, very interesting hip-hop reading program. Our kids like to do that, so we have them involved with that. We have adventure games of various kinds. We have straight drill and practice games. So if the kids are learning new things and they can do it on their own, cool. Step back and let them do it, but you can fill in for them so that they can experience success and know what it's like. Then later on they'll have other opportunities without so much support that they're going to have to practice it. But just the variability in the environment basically ensures that that kind of thing is going to happen. Drawing from Vygotsky's ideas about the central role of mediation in human thought, we view the computers as media, as an environment that people can use to interact through. And we interact around things intellectual, but the interaction itself is social. The deal with the way we do it is that they don't sit at the computer by themselves, and when they're playing whatever the computer game is, they're doing it in terms of what we call a task card, which is, when you're in the fifth dimension, being considered a beginner, a good player, or an expert player is defined not by the game itself, but by your ability to carry out tasks that are specified on the task card. And we use the task card and the undergraduates and our mythical figure, who here is called El Maga.
All of those things happen in the context of interacting intimately, closely, sitting on their laps or touching them. They learn that they can trust these people that come here.
I mean, I have to be very careful because of mores of American society to take kids on my lap, right? But my undergraduate girl sits down here and takes a 5-year-old on her lap. Nobody cares. I mean, nobody's going to even notice. So she's there and the kid has the mouse, but the undergraduate is, negotiating with the child and sort of focusing on things that will do the child some good. The technology is subordinated to the people, to the quality of social interaction that you have. You can do it with any kind of content, absolutely any kind of content. And the kids are learning. They're doing better in school. So what can I say? It's a good, and the undergraduates, it's just a priceless experience for the undergraduates. I learn a lot of theoretically important things here, right? I learn very important things from my reading and work at the university and other kinds of things. But to me, the great thing is to be able to combine the two. Here you're seeing one instantiation of how an entire environment is organized to be a zone of proximal development. Every fifth dimension has its own microculture, its own what I call idioculture, as in idiosyncratic. And I don't think there's one way to do this kind of thing. I really don't.
Our last sustainability study shows us that the children that we worked with 10 years ago, who are now young adults in their 20s, all of them had gone on to receive some level of higher education.
People like to come here. They come here distracted by their problems in life. They leave here feeling better.
The Eastside Institute for Group and Short-Term Psychotherapy is an international research and training center for new approaches to human development and community building. Our philosophy is very influenced by the work, the writings of Lev Vygotsky, as well as other people. We take learning and development, emotional development, social development, moral development, to be number one, social activities, and number two, to be really the basis for a new psychology, a psychology of becoming, a psychology of who people are becoming. We begin from this not very well referenced phrase of Vygotsky's when he's talking about play, children's play, and why play is developmental. He says that in play, children perform a head taller than they are. The Developing Teachers Fellowship Program has 11 teachers in it. They are from preschool through high school, and they are all creative teachers. We basically teach them about our conception and understanding of learning as a performance, and also we teach them improvisation skills. So the teachers, in teaching their young people improv games as both a way of learning and a way of building social skills and social responsibility, are finding that they actually can be much more advanced in teaching the content.
Zip. That's okay, keep it going. Zip. Zap. Zap. Zip. Zap.
I am a Vygotskian. I believe that children need to be pushed to go beyond themselves. And that's what we establish while we play. And that develops that environment where everybody can participate and push each other to improve in various ways. Initially, when we started playing, there was a level of frustration involved because the children aren't as good at the games.
Listen, I'll do it again. Good.
And they become better over time. When we started playing the games, a boy, for example, would drop the ball and they would yell at him right away. Now we've established a lot of tolerance and we've become more focused, so we don't drop the ball as often. I use the games during transitional periods when children are losing focus, which often happens during testing and preparation for tests. You can bring them back easily with a game, and then you can go through more of that work and then play some more, and it just helps to create the environment where children can continuously learn.
Zip. Zap. Zip. Whoosh. 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 Wow.
What we're finding with this program is that for the 300 or 400 children that are impacted on by the dozen teachers that we're training, if the only thing that was happening is that they are having a much better school experience, even only with those teachers, it would be well worth it. But we're finding that it's having much more significance, that children are capable of far more than they're allowed to do in structured environments where it's totally individualistic. Another program, actually another organization that has advanced our performatory social therapeutic approach is the All-Stars Project. It's a performing arts and educational center. The All-Stars has 4 youth programs that are performance-based. So young people, especially young inner city kids, poor youth, one of the only places they're allowed to be creative and to create new performances is on the stage. The slogan of the All-Stars, as well as the Institute, is if you can perform on the stage, you can perform in life.
You may now kiss the bride.
Kick this one for Brooklyn.
Pump up the volume.
When I talk about a group-oriented approach that's Vygotskian, I'm talking about the creating of zones of proximal development. Most Vygotskians, and then the trickling down into textbooks for either developmental psychologists, youth workers, or educators, talks about the zone of proximal development as a dyadic relationship between an expert and a novice. That is obviously a reading of Vygotsky. It's not our reading of Vygotsky. Our reading of Vygotsky is that zones of proximal development are, number one, not places and not spaces, but they are activities. Or if you will, to go back to the performance metaphor, they're stages. The creating of stages for growth, the creating of stages for learning. So in a therapy and in social therapy, Vygotsky helped us to understand how this strange and radical therapy actually worked, because it is the activity of the group members to create the group where they can get help. That is the help. The unity of creating the group and the, quote, result of creating the group are one. The zone of proximal development looks a certain way in a social therapy group, and it looks a different way in a classroom of second graders, or on the stage in the development school for youth, or in some corporate office down on Wall Street. However, the methodology is similar, which is that groups are what develop, and when people participate in creating groups for their need, for their learning need, for their development need, doesn't matter. When they do that, all the individuals in that group learn. How do you give that group its voice without stifling any of the individual voices? And I understand, in a sense, the zone of proximal development to be the way that happens. People being supported to continuously create new overlapping zones of proximal development where the input of all is used to create something new.
A long time ago now, I was deputy principal in a special school for young people with moderate learning difficulties. At that time, these young people were sent to a school, and it was some sort of, as it were, treatment for their, supposedly to meet their needs. And part of my job was involved taking me around from one school to another. We used to meet in the other special schools in the authority. And what struck me very, very forcibly was these were wildly different places. One place, the curriculum would be like a secondary school with, there'd be a maths room, there'd be a science room, there'd be an art room. There were heads of departments. There was formality in the relations. At another school, it would be an integrated day. One teacher would teach his or her class of kids all day long. It would be a very flat structure. And when you looked at a whole number of things, the way the place was physically organized, the way works of art were displayed, the whole semiotic of the places were wildly different. And yet, children were sent to this kind of schooling as it were a uniform treatment, and this seemed just wrong. And anyway, we know that just going into a place, we go into some places like a school or a hospital or a clinic, and we feel fine. And other places we don't feel fine, we don't feel comfortable. And I was wanting at that time to do some work really in terms of professional development, asking what differences do these differences make? So if we think about, at that time I would have said, the culture of the school, what kind of effect does that have on the way children think, learn, feel? And interestingly, at the time when I spoke to someone in a college where the children went afterwards, after they'd finished school, she said, I can tell which school these kids have come from when they walk through the door. I don't have to look up on a register which school has sent them. I can tell by the type of person they are. In other words, she said there was some somewhat formative effect of the school that they'd been to on their way of being. What I've been doing is seeking to develop an analysis and description at the institutional level, which enables me to move from the principles that regulate the institution to the principles of communication and the possibilities for thinking within that. So it's taking the Vygotskian tool argument and looking at the way those tools are produced, tools, artifacts, the way they're produced and the way that production shapes the possibilities for young people. Most of the work has been with people who have been marginalized in one way or another. So whether it's young people with difficulty in learning or young people who find it difficult to stay in school and school find it difficult to keep hold of them. So in that sense, we're asking questions about the way in which institutions marginalize and the consequences for ways of being for young people inside that. How often do we ask the question, what way should we organize a school? Let's try and understand the kinds of, the relation between institutional formations and a broader range of outcomes. And then with those kind of scientific tools in our hands, we can make choices about what kind of school we want to create.
In Vancouver, there is a new school that is called Mediated Learning Academy, and they implement a lot of Vygotskian ideas and ideas of Professor Feuerstein from Jerusalem for children with special needs, and they achieve absolutely great results. So I'm happy that these ideas are fruitfully implemented in Canada.
Mediated Learning Academy is the only school of its kind in North America or anywhere, I would say. And what we do here is we like to treat the whole child. So we look at the child as a whole entity and we don't look at bits and pieces. So while we work on academics and the academic portion with them and we modify and adapt as needed, we also use mediated learning experience and the programs associated with mediated learning with them. We also have occupational therapists, physiotherapists, speech-language pathologists, school counselors that work with our students. So we look at the whole child. We work on the learning, we work on the social-emotional development with them, and we also work on their body. Because we always feel that all parts have to work together sort of an integrated circle, and if they don't, and there are pieces missing, it is going to affect learning. At this school, we have children with 29 different diagnoses. And they range anywhere from autism to learning disabilities to gifted learning disabilities to genetic disorders. We have a limit of 10 per class, and we make sure with the classes that we have a diverse makeup. So we may have 1 or 2 autistic students in a class, but not more than that. So it isn't a class of autistic students. So that each child has a different kind of role model, and each student may be good in a particular area. And then they learn from each other, and there's good role models no matter what the child's disability. The 2 main principles that we work on at the school and within those programs are, the first one is mediation. And Vygotsky has certain ideas about mediation, and we certainly use mediational criteria here as set out and scaffolded by Feuerstein. So we use his principles of mediation. The second one is the zone of proximal development. And I think that's so important to say, this is where your manifest functioning is, this is where you can be, and the zone that's in between. So we constantly try and scaffold children, help them into the zone, help them think and acquire skills for themselves by using cognitive functions, by the way that we teach, by the mediation that we use, so that we can improve their overall manifest functioning. So it pushes the zone a little bit higher all the time.
How do we call this line, Annalisa?
Direct
or
horizontal
line. And now, do we have another line here? Look.
Yep.
How do we call this line?
Horizontal.
We call this line vertical. Vertical. And this line also will go through the center. Can you show me where is our center? Show me our center.
Here.
Very good. Now the vertical line will go through the center.
Here to there.
Exactly. Let's do it.
With this child, there is very good potential
for change. And it's very clear what we need to work on. We need to work on her ability to integrate information, to see relationship. Even when she was doing the figure, it was very interesting because this part of her body was not existing in relation to this part of her body. She was like this. This hand didn't even come into it.
Help yourself with this hand to hold the paper.
So again, the occupational therapist needs to work on bilateral integration. This is all about integrating information, seeing things in relationship, seeing things as connected wholes, so that she begins to have comprehension, and with that comprehension will also come better memory.
And Elisa has a hard time in knowing where her body is in space, in moving through space, in using the two sides of her body. And so what we're working on both with the swing and the walrus mat is to create the feeling of the two sides of the body as she sort of flows between the two, which you're sort of forced to do whenever you have to balance.
So dynamic assessment is essentially a test, teach, test paradigm, but in many ways it's a lot more than that. You're looking at what a child can do on a task, and then you mediate, and this is really the central issue in dynamic assessment. You mediate, and then you look what the child did after that. Your assessment of the child is partially based on what the child did on his or her own, but a lot of your assessment is based on how did the child respond to your mediation, what changes did the child make. Dynamic assessment, one of the rules is you're not allowed to stop until the child has had a measure of success. So if the child cannot do it after your mediation, you look at yourself. What did I do what didn't I do? You know, the child has to be able to benefit by my mediation.
Now, let's look again. What do I have inside this rectangle?
X.
X. And what are these two lines that make an X? How do we call them? Diagonals. Yes, let's make these two lines that will make X. And remember, they're from this dot
to this dot.
Very good. Excellent. And now from
this dot to that.
Very good. And they will meet in the center. That will be on this horizontal line.
So the child leaves a dynamic assessment situation always a head taller, rather than always fearful, did I do, how did I do? It is a hopeful model. It looks at what is the potential for change as opposed to what are all the deficiencies and stopping there.
The fundamental belief that we have at the school is that beings and entities can change. For all the programs, we use Vygotsky's notions. So when you walk into one of our classrooms, you don't necessarily see 10 kids sitting at a desk with a math textbook. You may see them acting out a math concept.
5 plus 4 is 9.
And that's a completely different way of looking at academics. I think that it's really unfortunate that Vygotsky died so young, because I think he was dramatically ahead of his time in his ideas about integration, in his ideas about mediation, and his ideas about cognitive functioning in the brain.
I graduated from Moscow Electronical University as an engineer in electronical studies, and I get my second degree in psychology and education, and I leave my electronical studies and my job for very, very interesting and very small salary job in academic of educational studies. And my first teacher in psychology and first boss was academic Davidov and academic Elkonin. They were Vygotsky students. From my first step in absolutely new area after electronics, I started to be a teacher, psychologist in high school, in university, and it was unusual for me and very exciting. I was psychologist, I was educator. I had my personal, very nice TV program on the governmental channel 1 in Soviet TV, family screen. I was well-known person. At the same time, disaster happened in my family. I like ski very much, and my daughter asked me to taught her ski. And from the first lesson of ski, she was very young. She was eight years old. She fell down, and stick come to her eyes inside and damaged her eyes nerve. The same time on TV, on Soviet TV, there were very strong anti-Semitic movement against Jewish people in TV. I got message to go out. They didn't want me. And it was kind of a red light that I decide I should change something for my family, for my daughter, for myself. And I came to Jerusalem, and I was happy to find here nice psychological institutions. And of course, I was very happy to find here people who involved in Vygotsky approach. I have several activities with blind people. The first activity I has developed several cognitive tools for blind learners. The name of the program, Tactile Instrument Enrichment Program for the Blind, developed by me and my colleagues in Forstein's Institute, in International Center of Enhancement of Learning Potential. The same time I involved as a consultant of Ministry of Education to help talented blind, totally blind children to get their high-level results in high school and to be prepared for university studies. At the same time, I involved in activities with multi-handicap blind children who need enhancement by using free channels of information, not sight, but hearing, touching, movement, to enhance their potential to study in regular school, in mainstream, or in special education. Last one is my research and development of kind of electronical devices for blind people, and also all these activities based on Vygotsky theories, because Vygotsky told us to find out how different type of cognitive tools can help in learning process. The moment that you look on computer screen, you can get information by your sight what is on a screen. Blind person have no chance. The first idea to build for blind learner to build something like a tactile screen instead of computer screen. To build kind of table that you can move pins up and down and to touch such a pins as a three-dimensional object. We discovered that Metac company from Germany, they did kind of screen like this. The only thing, it was very, very, very expensive device, $500,000 per one device, per one. And also a lot of mechanical problems. And we decided to check what we can do in different way. The moment that I touch a screen like this, I can feel only small part of pins. Let's say on the low right corner, or only on the upper left corner. Other pins, they are not working for me this moment. So I don't need all the pins simultaneously. I need only small part pins for my fingertips. Instead of thousands pins, I need only, let's say, several tens, not small. So if I put several tens pins under my fingertips, and I put this small screen for fingertip on a mouse, I have very nice combination of tactile screens and mouse, input and output device under one palm. The moment that I have it, I can explore virtual two-dimensional space as a real screen, and I feel in each area on a real screen, here's I feel pins make the same shape as an icon. Through audio channel, I can listen what icon is. So by using this kind of virtual touch system, I can check all kind of graphic information. I can supply blind people with computer games.
Shoot it. Trap it.
אתה טוב היום. You are good.
Shoot it.
I can supply blind people with tactile maps in electronic forms. I can supply them with special braille. They can read braille also. So the main idea and the main concept of Vygotsky here, not as a hardware, not as a device, but a program. All programs here based on to build mental image of a concept in a blind student mind, to use symbolic representation as a tool to understand meaning of concepts, to use two-dimensional area as an area to navigate, as a mental map to navigate left, right, up, down, to use fine motor coordination to help in this process of building of mental library of images. And all application in our system based on main concepts of Vygotsky, cognitive tools, special type of representation, using different channels of information simultaneously, and as a developed package, as you can see, it works not only now in Israel, but also in different countries.
תעשה גם קפיצה וגם זה, שיהיה ליתר ביטחון. בסדר?
Stupid puddle! You fell off the motorcycle.
And herein lies the challenge. Can we preserve and honor the spirit of the past and the legacy of time, and yet advance into the 21st century?
A lot of things impressed me because, in my opinion, he is really a great scientist and psychologist of the 20th century. But probably one feature of his writing and his theories are particularly interesting, especially in comparison with some other great psychologists. And this his ability to be very historical, in the sense that he always appreciated people who contributed to his own understanding of the problems. He never claims, I think so. Even when his ideas are very original, he always quotes other people who contributed to the development of this thing. It's pretty rare phenomenon these days when everyone wants to say that he or she is very original and no one before did anything good. So this impressed me a lot, but also gave me much better perspective on the situation in psychology in the beginning of 20th century and the development based on his kind of synthesis of different trends.
The legacy of his humanity, the legacy of his caring, the stories about his sharing the one desk that the family had, Vygotsky, all of these qualities bring forth a sense of caring on those of us who are students of Vygotsky, for him as a person, for what he represented, as much as for his ideas that we are still being inspired by.
Postmodern approach is to defend the minorities, the problem of gender. We have in the United States many different movements, political movements, radical movements, also movement gay and the lesbian movements. When they refer to psychology, they refer not to Freud or Piaget and so on, but to neo-Vygotskyan approach. And of course, not to Vygotsky of the Soviet age, of many years ago, but to the metaphorical idea of Vygotsky as the leader of psychology open to differences, to culture, to minorities. So I think this is the most remarkable heritage we have from that school.
А главное, почему культурно-историческая психология вечная, она была в прошлом, она есть сейчас, она будет...
What is important is why cultural historical psychology seems endless. It existed in the past, it exists in the present, and it will continue to exist in the future from our efforts and the efforts of those who call themselves historical cultural psychologists.
We have a problem where we use common terms, but they don't mean the same thing in the two languages. And very few people are bilingual, and even my bilingualism is such that I rely now on my ability to communicate with Russians who are bilingual in English and Russian, and we trade. We talk about these concepts and how we understand them and their meanings. The Russian word Сознание is consciousness, and there's a word called asoznание, and like I need help trying to understand, because Vygotsky uses both of these terms. What did he have in mind when he was trying to talk about that? So we have ongoing worldwide discussions about the meaning of very key terms.
It's very hard to know what I would have thought, or anybody would have thought, had they had the opportunity to meet Vygotsky. Reading him is. There are very few authors for whom I'd say reading somebody is just a pleasure every time you go back. As a reader of Vygotsky, as a communer of Vygotskyan texts, I think it's, I don't know what he was like personally, but it's a great genius to go along and to watch his thought unfold and be just riding along the top of that sometimes on a daily basis.
Главное, мне хотелось бы, чтобы люди знали, что это был честнейший, порядочнейший.
The point is, he was a man of great integrity, a most decent person with good manners who loved everybody around him and never dared burden the life of another person. He was a wonderful man. It seems to me that this is the main thing.
Chuchev said, "Not everything that was must pass." Vygotsky continues to live through his scientific discovery, current practice based on cultural historical theory, and by the integrity with which he lived his life.